In the year 1856, in a town so small it barely appeared on maps of the American South, there existed a world built on contradictions. Whitewashed churches stood beside auction blocks. Hymns of salvation rose into the same sky that witnessed unspeakable cruelty. And in the heart of this town, within the grandest house on the main street, lived a young woman who would come to understand that the greatest rebellion often begins not with violence, but with a single, illuminating question. What if everything I have been taught is a lie? Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching us from, and please subscribe and like this video to support the channel. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. Her name was Clara Whitfield, and she was 22 years old when her life changed forever. The daughter of Reverend Whitfield, she had grown up surrounded by scripture and sermons, by the weight of expectation and the suffocating embrace of a righteousness that demanded obedience above all else. Her father was not merely a preacher, he was the preacher, the man whose voice carried the authority of heaven itself, whose word could condemn or absolve, whose approval the entire town sought like starving men seeking bread. The Whitfield house was a monument to this power. 3 stories of pristine white columns and dark shutters, it lorded over the town square like a fortress of faith. Inside, every surface gleamed with polish, every corner held a Bible, every wall bore witness to the family's position at the pinnacle of society. But beneath this veneer of godliness lived a truth that Clara had been taught never to question. Her family's wealth, their status, their very way of life was built upon the ownership of human souls. There were 12 people enslaved in the Whitfield household, 12 men, women, and children whose lives belonged not to themselves, but to the man who preached about mercy every Sunday morning. Among them was a young man named Isaiah, 24 years old, whose quiet intelligence and calm dignity set him apart in ways that both fascinated and frightened those who noticed. Isaiah had been born into bondage on a tobacco plantation 60 miles east. His mother had taught him his letters in secret, tracing words in the dirt by moonlight, knowing that literacy was both forbidden and the most powerful weapon an enslaved person could possess. When she died, Isaiah was 15. 3 years later, he was sold to Reverend Whitfield, who purchased him not for field work, but for his intellect, his ability to read and keep accounts, his usefulness in maintaining the complex machinery of a household that pretended to be a sanctuary, but functioned as a prison. Clara first truly saw Isaiah in the spring of 1855. She had seen him countless times before, of course, in the way that one sees furniture or wallpaper, present but not truly perceived. But on a Tuesday afternoon in April, as she entered her father's study to retrieve a forgotten book, she found Isaiah there, standing before the bookshelf with a volume in his hands. It was not a ledger or a household record. It was Plato's Republic, and he was reading it with an expression of such profound hunger that Clara stopped in the doorway, transfixed. He became aware of her presence, and the book snapped shut. Fear flickered across his face, the practiced fear of someone who knows that any moment of humanity, any glimpse of an interior life, could be punished. But Clara did something unexpected. She asked him what he thought of the allegory of the cave. And in that moment, in that simple question that acknowledged him as a thinking being rather than property, everything began to change. Their conversation started cautiously, stolen moments in the parlor room where Clara was tasked with reading scripture to the household servants on Wednesday evenings. While the others listened to her recitations of Psalms and Proverbs, Clara began to notice that Isaiah listened differently. He heard the contradictions, the places where the words of mercy clashed with the reality of their application, and slowly, carefully, they began to speak about these contradictions. Isaiah showed her his writings, hidden beneath a loose board in the small cabin he shared With 3 other men, wrapped in oilcloth to protect against moisture, were pages and pages of careful script, essays on natural rights and human dignity, copied from abolitionist pamphlets that had arrived mixed among church mail and been deemed too dangerous to circulate, too inflammatory to acknowledge, yet not quite dangerous enough for the Reverend to report their arrival. Isaiah had salvaged them from the burning barrel, reading them by candlelight, copying the arguments that spoke to the deepest truth of his existence, that he was a man, whole and sovereign, regardless of what the law proclaimed. Clara read these writings in secret, her hands trembling, her world tilting on its axis. The language was beautiful and devastating, logical and passionate. It spoke of a world that could exist beyond the one she knew, a world where the color of skin did not determine the content of character, where love and marriage and family were rights, rather than privileges granted by those who believed themselves superior. And it was in reading these words that Clara realized she had fallen in love, not merely with Isaiah, though her feelings for him grew deeper each day, but with the possibility he represented, the possibility of a life lived in truth rather than comfortable lies, the possibility of rebellion not through violence, but through the assertion of fundamental humanity. By the summer of 1855, their connection had deepened into something neither of them could deny. They loved each other with the desperate intensity of two people who understand that their love is not just forbidden, but could be fatal. In the eyes of the law, in the teachings of Clara's father, in the unwritten rules that governed every interaction in their world, what existed between them was not merely improper, it was unspeakable. It was a crime against nature, against God, against the very foundations upon which their society was built. But Clara had come to understand something her father never would. The system that enslaved Isaiah, that denied him agency over his own life, that treated him as property rather than person, was itself the crime against nature. And if loving him was sin, then she would embrace that sin gladly, for it contained more truth than all her father's sermons combined. The turning point came on an October evening, 1855, when Reverend Whitfield discovered Isaiah's hidden writings. A routine inspection of the servants' quarters, conducted with the practiced suspicion of a man who trusted no one, revealed the loose board and the cash beneath. The Reverend read the papers with mounting rage, his face flushing deeper red with each paragraph. Here was proof of the danger he had always preached about. Literacy leading to ideas, ideas leading to rebellion, rebellion threatening the natural order that kept everyone in their proper place. That night, in the yard behind the Whitfield house, while the household watched in enforced silence, the Reverend built a fire and burned every page. Isaiah was forced to watch, his face impassive but his hands clenched so tightly his fingernails drew blood from his palms. The flames consumed months of careful work, years of accumulated thought, the evidence of a mind that refused to accept the limitations placed upon it. Clara watched from her bedroom window, and in the dancing light of those flames, she felt something ignite within her. Not just anger, though she burned with that. Not just grief, though she felt it like a physical wound. But something colder, harder, more dangerous to the established order than any emotion. She felt the crystallization of purpose. If her father would destroy evidence of Isaiah's humanity, then she would help Isaiah prove it in a way that could not be burned. She would help him escape, and she would go with him. But escape required more than desire. It required planning, resources, and above all, it required a network. Over the following months, Clara and Isaiah began to build something extraordinary, a conspiracy hidden within the very heart of her father's power. The Reverend's position gave him access to the mail routes, to the comings and goings of travelers, to the financial records of missionary work that took church members to distant cities. Clara had grown up helping with this work, managing correspondence, organizing donations, keeping track of which members of the congregation contributed to which causes. Her father trusted her completely in these tasks, never imagining that his dutiful daughter might turn his own systems against him. Isaiah, meanwhile, had access to something equally valuable: the trust of the other enslaved people in the household and the wider community. His intelligence and calm demeanor made him a natural leader, someone others looked to for guidance and hope. And unlike the Reverend, who saw the people he enslaved as interchangeable units of labor, Isaiah knew each person's story, each person's skills, each person's dreams of freedom. Together they began to weave a plan that was as much about liberation as it was about love. Using the church's own mail system, Isaiah began encoding messages within seemingly innocent correspondence, biblical citations that actually referenced abolitionist safe houses, donation receipts that contained hidden information about escape routes, prayer requests that were actually calls for assistance to sympathetic contacts in the North. Clara's role was even more audacious. She began to systematically divert church funds, small amounts at first, money that her father would never miss from the substantial donations that poured in from wealthy congregants eager to demonstrate their piety. These funds went not to mission work, as the ledgers claimed, but to bribing officials, purchasing false documents, and supporting the underground network of people who risked everything to help the enslaved reach freedom. Their nightly meetings became the nerve center of this quiet revolution. In a small storage room off the kitchen, lit by a single candle that they extinguished at the first sound of footsteps, Clara and Isaiah planned with the precision of generals preparing for war. They mapped routes, identified allies, calculated risks, and gradually assembled the pieces of an escape plan that would save not just themselves, but multiple families. The candle became their symbol, that small flame in the darkness representing everything they were fighting for: illumination against ignorance, warmth against cruelty, the persistent light of hope that no amount of oppression could completely extinguish. As winter gave way to spring in 1856, the network Clara and Isaiah had built began to show results. The first family to successfully use their system was the Johnsons: Thomas, his wife Sarah, and their 3 children. Using forged travel documents that identified them as freed servants accompanying a missionary to Philadelphia, and armed with detailed instructions about safe houses and sympathetic conductors, they disappeared one March night and were never recaptured. News of their escape sent shockwaves through the community. Reverend Whitfield preached fire and brimstone about the sin of running away, about the divine mandate of the social order, about the chaos that would ensue if the enslaved population began to believe they could simply leave. But Clara, sitting in the front pew with her hands folded and her face serene, felt only triumph. The system could be beaten, freedom was possible, and she and Isaiah had proven it. But success brought danger. Every escape increased scrutiny. Slave catchers prowled the roads with renewed vigilance. The Reverend began conducting more frequent inspections, questioning his household more aggressively, watching for any sign of conspiracy or rebellion. The candle meetings had to become even more careful, even more brief, the risks of discovery growing with each passing week. Isaiah developed an ingenious system of communication that kept the network functioning despite the increased surveillance. He would incorporate messages into the hymns he led during the servants' prayer meetings, changing a word here or a phrase there in ways that seemed like simple mistakes but actually conveyed crucial information. A changed line in Amazing Grace might indicate that a route was compromised. An extra verse in Swing Low, Sweet Chariot could signal that a safe house was ready to receive travelers. Clara, meanwhile, learned to weaponize her father's own sermons. She would ask seemingly innocent questions at the dinner table, leading him toward biblical passages about mercy and compassion, then quietly share his own words with members of the congregation who were beginning to question the morality of slavery. She was planting seeds of doubt in the very community that sustained the system, using her father's authority against itself. In May of 1856, a visiting deacon from Charleston arrived to audit the church's financial records. He was a meticulous man, known for catching discrepancies that others missed, and his arrival filled Clara with cold dread. For 3 days he pored over the ledgers, his finger tracing down columns of numbers, his brow furrowed in concentration. Clara maintained her composure during the day, but at night she could barely sleep, imagining the discovery that would surely come. On the 3rd day, the deacon called her into her father's study. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she entered, certain that this was the end, that all their work would be exposed and they would both pay the ultimate price. But the deacon simply had questions about certain missionary expenditures, details about travel costs and supply purchases. Clara answered with the careful precision of someone who has rehearsed every possible scenario. Her voice steady even as her hands trembled. She provided receipts she had carefully forged, letters from fictional missionaries describing fictional work, and after an hour of questioning, the deacon closed his books, satisfied. That night, in the candlelit room, Isaiah held Clara's shaking hands in his and said something she would never forget. He said that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. He said that every small victory against an unjust system was itself an act of revolution, that even if they failed, even if they were discovered and punished, they had already succeeded in proving that resistance was possible. But Isaiah also said something else, something that Clara initially resisted but eventually came to understand. He said that their love, as powerful and real as it was, could not be the only goal, that if they escaped alone, leaving others in bondage, they would carry that weight forever. That true freedom required not just personal liberation, but collective action, that their revolution had to be bigger than themselves. And so they expanded their operations. A widowed schoolteacher named Mrs. Harrison, who had secretly been teaching enslaved children to read, joined their network. She provided education and connections to abolitionist societies in the North. A stable boy named Daniel, who had access to horses and knowledge of back roads, became their guide and scout. A choir singer named Grace, whose powerful voice could mask coded conversations during church gatherings, became their messenger. Each person who joined the network brought new capabilities and new risks. More people meant more chances of betrayal, more opportunities for a careless word or a suspicious action to unravel everything. But it also meant more power, more reach, more people who could be saved. By the summer of 1856, they had successfully helped 7 families escape to freedom. 7 families who now lived in Philadelphia, New York, and Boston, working as free laborers, attending schools, building lives that would have been impossible in the South. The success rate was extraordinary, a testament to the careful planning and coordination of Clara and Isaiah's network. But the Reverend was growing suspicious. He had noticed small things: Clara's distraction at meals, the way certain servants seemed to communicate without speaking, the subtle changes in household rhythms that most people would miss, but that a man accustomed to total control could not ignore. He began to watch more carefully, to question more aggressively, to create an atmosphere of paranoia designed to break down any conspiracy through fear alone. In late August, Isaiah had a close call that nearly destroyed everything. He was discovered delivering a package to a known sympathizer, a shopkeeper who provided supplies to escaped families. The package contained forged documents and money, but it was wrapped to appear as a simple delivery of church materials. When questioned by a suspicious constable, Isaiah had to think quickly. He explained that he was delivering missionary pamphlets on behalf of Reverend Whitfield, materials meant to spread the gospel to frontier settlements. Then, in a stroke of brilliance that Clara would later call the boldest thing she had ever witnessed, Isaiah began to quote scripture. Not just any scripture, but the exact passages the Reverend had preached the previous Sunday, word for word, delivered with such conviction and apparent devotion that even the constable was moved. The constable let him go, and when Isaiah reported back to the Reverend about the encounter, painting himself as a faithful servant diligently executing his master's wishes, the Reverend actually praised him. It was a masterful piece of performance, using the oppressor's own tools and language as a shield. But it was also a warning. They were being watched. The margins for error were shrinking, and their time was running out. That night, Clara and Isaiah made the final decision. They would execute one last ambitious plan. They would arrange the escape of 2 more families, including Isaiah himself, Clara, and several others from the Whitfield household. They would use the cover of a missionary journey that Clara had fabricated, complete with forged letters of introduction, travel documents, and a detailed itinerary that would take them north to Philadelphia, where contacts were waiting to receive them. The date was set for October 14th, 1856. Everything was prepared. The documents were perfect. The route was secure. The safe houses were ready. Clara had even managed to divert enough funds to ensure everyone would have money to start their new lives. After more than a year of planning, of risk, of living every moment with the fear of discovery, they were finally ready. But in the quiet hours before dawn on October 10th, 4 days before their planned escape, everything fell apart. The betrayal came from a place they never expected: desperation. One of the household servants, a man named Josiah, who had always seemed loyal, had been caught by the Reverend attempting to steal food for his sick daughter. The punishment was brutal and designed to extract information. Under the threat of his daughter being sold away, separated forever from her father, Josiah broke. He told the Reverend everything he knew about the escape plans, about the network, about Clara and Isaiah's relationship. The Reverend's rage was cold and calculated. He did not confront them immediately. Instead, he set a trap. He allowed the preparations to continue, watching as Clara gathered the final supplies, as Isaiah made the last arrangements with the families who would be escaping. The Reverend wanted to catch them in the act, to have undeniable proof not just of an escape attempt, but of his daughter's betrayal of her race, her class, and her father. On the night of October 13th, as Clara and Isaiah met one final time in their small room with its single candle, the Reverend was gathering a group of men from the town. Not just any men, but the most violent, the most committed to maintaining the racial order that gave their lives meaning. These were men who saw the very existence of their world threatened by the idea of an enslaved person escaping, let alone a white woman choosing to leave with an enslaved man. Clara and Isaiah knew something was wrong the moment they heard the footsteps. Too many, too heavy, moving with purpose toward their hiding place. They had time for one look between them, one moment where everything that needed to be said passed silently in that shared glance. Then the door burst open and their small sanctuary was flooded with harsh lantern light and angry voices. The Reverend stood in the doorway, his face a mask of righteous fury. Behind him, the assembled men carried ropes and weapons, their faces twisted with the peculiar excitement that comes when cruelty is sanctioned by authority. They dragged Isaiah out first, his body limp with resignation, but his eyes still blazing with defiance. Then they turned to Clara, and in that moment the Reverend faced a choice that would define his legacy. He could have hidden this, could have sent Clara away to distant relatives, claimed illness or impropriety of a vague nature, allowed his daughter to disappear into obscurity, rather than public shame. But the Reverend was a man who believed that his authority came from God, that his judgment was divine, will made manifest, and so he decided to make an example that would echo through generations. He announced that the next day, Sunday, October 14th, after the morning service, there would be a public reckoning. Isaiah would be punished for the crime of reading, for the crime of conspiring to escape, for the crime of daring to believe he was equal to his betters. The punishment would be carried out in the town square before the entire congregation, and Clara would be there to witness what her sinful choices had wrought. That night, locked in her room, Clara heard Isaiah being beaten in the yard below. She heard the crack of the whip, the grunts of pain that he could not completely suppress, the jeering of the men who found entertainment in his suffering, and she made a decision that would transform her from passive victim to active agent in her own story. She would not be silent. She would not allow her father to control the narrative. If they were going to punish Isaiah publicly, then she would speak publicly. She would tell the town exactly what she and Isaiah had been doing, and more importantly, why they had done it. She would force them to confront the reality they preferred to ignore, that the system they defended was built on unspeakable cruelty, and that defending it made them complicit in that cruelty. Sunday morning dawned clear and cold. The church filled early, everyone eager to witness the spectacle that had been promised. The Reverend's sermons were always powerful, but today there was an extra current of excitement, the dark thrill of seeing justice as they understood it being served. The service was longer than usual. The Reverend preached about sin and redemption, about the dangers of pride and the necessity of obedience. He spoke about the natural order ordained by God, about the responsibilities of those who had been blessed with superiority to guide and control those who had not. His voice rang through the church with the absolute certainty of a man who had never questioned his own righteousness. When the service ended, the congregation filed out into the square where a platform had been erected. Isaiah was brought out, his hands bound, his back already bearing the marks of the previous night's beating. The Reverend announced his crimes, embellishing them with details both real and imagined, painting Isaiah as a dangerous instigator who had corrupted innocent servants and threatened the stability of the community. Then Clara stepped forward. She had not been invited to speak. She had been seated in a place of shame, meant to watch in silent penitence. But she rose from her seat and walked to the platform with her head held high, and before anyone could stop her, she began to speak. She spoke about the hypocrisy of a faith that preached love while practicing cruelty. She spoke about her father's corruption of church funds, about his manipulation of Scripture to justify his own power. She spoke about the families who had escaped with her help, about the network of good people who had risked everything because they knew in their hearts that slavery was wrong regardless of what the law said. And she spoke about Isaiah, not as property or as a dangerous criminal, but as a man of extraordinary intelligence and courage, a man who had taught himself to read in defiance of laws designed to keep him ignorant, a man who had used his gifts not for revenge, but for liberation, not just of himself, but of others, a man she loved, and a man who had shown her what true righteousness looked like. The crowd's reaction was violent and immediate. Shouts of outrage, cries of blasphemy, demands that she be silenced. But Clara kept speaking, her voice rising above the tumult, forcing them to hear even if they refused to listen. She said that if loving Isaiah was sin, then she embraced that sin gladly, because it contained more truth and more godliness than everything her father had ever preached. The Reverend, his face purple with rage, ordered the punishment to proceed. The whip was raised, but before it could fall, something remarkable happened. Mrs. Harrison, the widowed schoolteacher, stood up from the crowd and said, simply and clearly, that if Clara was guilty of sin, then so was she. She had taught enslaved children to read. She had knowingly and deliberately violated the law because the law was unjust. Then Daniel, the stable boy, stepped forward. He had guided escaped families along hidden trails. He had provided horses and supplies. If there was to be punishment, he said, then he too should face it. One by one, members of the network revealed themselves, each person standing up and declaring their participation in the conspiracy, each person choosing to face punishment rather than allow Isaiah and Clara to face it alone. It was an act of collective courage that the Reverend had not anticipated, a demonstration that the network was wider and deeper than he had imagined. But the Reverend was not a man who could be moved by courage or solidarity. He ordered his men to seize all those who had confessed, to bind them and prepare them for punishment. The crowd, whipped into a frenzy by his rhetoric and their own fear of social change, surged forward. What happened next was chaos and violence, the kind of mob action that history would record as a tragedy, but that those present would remember as justice served. In the confusion, some members of the network managed to escape into the crowd and disappear. Daniel and Grace slipped away in the tumult. Mrs. Harrison was protected by her advanced age and her connections to prominent families who, while they may have disapproved of her actions, could not countenance physical violence against a respected widow. But Isaiah and Clara had no such protection. They were dragged to separate parts of the square, meant to witness each other's punishment as the final cruelty. The Reverend pronounced sentence. Isaiah would be sold away to the deepest South, to plantations where life expectancy was measured in months rather than years. Clara would be institutionalized, declared mentally unsound, her property and rights stripped away, her very existence erased from polite society. As the men moved to enact these sentences, Clara did something that no one expected. She broke free from those holding her and ran to Isaiah. In front of the entire town, before her father and the congregation and everyone who had come to watch justice be served, she took Isaiah's bound hands in hers and said the words that would echo through history. If we must suffer for loving each other, then we will suffer together. But we will not apologize. We will not recant. We will not pretend that what we feel is wrong when it is the most right thing in this broken world. The Reverend, faced with his daughter's absolute defiance, made the choice that would haunt him for the rest of his days. He ordered them both to be locked in the church, in the cellar beneath the sanctuary, while he decided on a punishment suitable for their crimes. They were dragged away as the crowd watched, some in approval, others in growing discomfort at the spectacle they were witnessing. But the Reverend had miscalculated in a fundamental way. He had assumed that his authority was absolute, that his congregation would follow him anywhere. He had not anticipated that some of them, watching Clara's courage and hearing her words, might begin to question, that some of them, seeing the cruelty with which she and Isaiah were treated, might remember that they too were taught that Christ spoke of mercy and forgiveness. That night, as Clara and Isaiah sat in the darkness of the church cellar, still bound but together, they heard sounds above them, footsteps, urgent whispers, the creak of the cellar door opening. They expected more violence, more punishment. Instead, they found rescue in the form of the least likely savior, the Reverend's own wife, Margaret Whitfield, accompanied by 2 church deacons who had been moved by Clara's speech. Margaret had spent 30 years in a loveless marriage, subjugated to her husband's will, taught that submission was virtue and silence was godliness. But watching her only daughter face punishment for the crime of love, Margaret had found within herself a strength she did not know she possessed. She could not save everyone, she could not dismantle the system, but she could save her daughter and the man her daughter loved. With keys stolen from the Reverend's desk and a wagon waiting in the alley behind the church, Margaret and the sympathetic deacons freed Clara and Isaiah. They gave them money, forged documents prepared by one of the deacons, and detailed instructions on reaching the first safe house. They had perhaps 6 hours before the escape would be discovered, 6 hours to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the town that had tried to destroy them. As Clara embraced her mother for what they both knew would be the last time, Margaret said something that Clara would carry with her always. She said that sometimes the greatest act of faith is not obedience, but resistance. That God, if God exists, surely values love over law, mercy over judgment, freedom over control. She said that Clara was braver than she had ever been, and that she was proud to be her mother. Then Clara and Isaiah disappeared into the night, racing north toward an uncertain future, but away from a certain doom. Behind them, Margaret returned to her husband's house and waited for the storm that would surely come when their absence was discovered. The journey north was harrowing. Despite the forged documents and the money, Clara and Isaiah traveled as fugitives, always looking over their shoulders, never certain that the next person they met would not be the one who betrayed them. They moved mostly at night, following the routes that Isaiah had helped map for others, staying in safe houses run by abolitionists who asked no questions but offered food, shelter, and guidance to the next stop on the Underground Railroad. Clara experienced for the first time what Isaiah had lived his entire life: the fear of being hunted, the exhaustion of constant vigilance, the humiliation of having to hide one's very existence. She had understood intellectually what the enslaved endured, but living it, even for a few weeks, transformed her understanding in profound ways. They reached Philadelphia on November 2nd, 1856, gaunt and exhausted but alive and free. The contacts they had cultivated through their network welcomed them, provided shelter while they adjusted to their new reality, and helped them begin to build a life that would have been impossible in the South. Isaiah found work as a typesetter for an abolitionist newspaper. His literacy and his eloquent writing made him valuable to the cause, and soon his essays about his experiences were being published under a pseudonym, read by thousands, contributing to the growing movement to end slavery. He wrote not with anger but with clarity, describing the daily realities of bondage, the systematic destruction of families, the violence that underlay every aspect of the system. Clara became an educator, teaching formerly enslaved people to read and write. She specialized in teaching women, understanding that education was not just about individual advancement, but about empowering entire communities. She taught with a passion that came from knowing exactly how dangerous education was to systems of oppression, how much slave owners feared the literate enslaved. But they did not forget those they had left behind. Using their connections and the network they had built, Clara and Isaiah continued their work from Philadelphia. They helped dozens more people escape, provided funds and guidance, and became key figures in the abolitionist movement of the late 1850s. They married in 1857 in a quiet ceremony attended by those who had helped them reach freedom. It was a marriage that would have been illegal in the South, that would have been considered an abomination by Clara's father. But it was also a marriage built on mutual respect, shared struggle, and a love that had been tested by fire and emerged stronger for it. Back in the small southern town they had fled, the consequences of their escape were profound and far-reaching. The Reverend's authority never recovered. His wife's role in the escape became known, and though she was not formally punished, she was forever marked as a traitor to her race and class. The church split, with some members leaving to form a new congregation led by one of the deacons who had helped free Clara and Isaiah. The Reverend himself descended into an obsession with recapturing his daughter and Isaiah, seeing their escape as a personal affront that had destroyed his reputation. He hired slave catchers, offered rewards, preached sermons about duty and obedience that grew increasingly unhinged. But Clara and Isaiah were beyond his reach, protected by distance and by the growing network of abolitionists who saw them as symbols of what was possible. Margaret Whitfield lived out her days in quiet dignity, maintaining her household but no longer subordinate to her husband's will. She never saw her daughter again, but they exchanged letters through trusted intermediaries, maintaining a connection across the divide that separated them. In these letters, Margaret revealed a woman of intelligence and feeling who had been suppressed for decades, and Clara came to understand that her mother's quiet strength had been its own form of resistance. The members of the network who had revealed themselves on that October day faced various fates. Some left the town, moving north or west, to start fresh where their reputations had not preceded them. Others remained, continuing their work more carefully, more secretly, knowing that every person they helped reach freedom was an act of defiance against the system that sought to crush them. Daniel eventually made his way north, working as a guide for the Underground Railroad and becoming known for his ability to move people safely through dangerous territory. Grace remained in the South, but used her position as a respected church singer to pass information and coordinate escapes, her coded hymns continuing to convey messages that saved lives. Mrs. Harrison continued teaching, though she had to be more circumspect about it. But word spread among the enslaved community that her school welcomed all students. And though she could not change the system, she changed individual lives, one reader at a time. The small town itself became a contested space in the debates about slavery that would soon tear the nation apart. Some residents pointed to the chaos of Clara and Isaiah's escape as proof that abolitionism led to disorder and violence. Others, particularly younger people who had witnessed Clara's courage, began to question the certainties they had been raised with. Seeds of doubt, once planted, are difficult to uproot. As the 1850s gave way to the 1860s and the nation moved inexorably toward civil war, Clara and Isaiah's story became part of the larger narrative of resistance. Abolitionist speakers told their tale as an example of love transcending hate, of courage in the face of overwhelming opposition, of the power of ordinary people to challenge extraordinary injustice. When the Civil War began in 1861, Isaiah volunteered immediately. He joined the Massachusetts 54th Regiment, one of the first African-American units in the Union Army, fighting to end the system that had enslaved him. He survived the war, though he bore scars both visible and invisible from the battles he fought. Clara worked throughout the war years supporting formerly enslaved people who fled north, providing education, shelter, and assistance. She established a school that would continue operating for decades, educating generations of African-American students and white students side by side, modeling the integrated society she believed was possible. After the war ended and slavery was abolished, Clara and Isaiah returned briefly to the small southern town they had fled. The Reverend had died during the war, still bitter and broken by what he saw as his daughter's betrayal. The church he had dominated was now led by a younger, more progressive minister who welcomed Clara and Isaiah and asked them to speak to the congregation. Standing in the sanctuary where she had sat through countless sermons justifying cruelty, Clara spoke about forgiveness and accountability. She said that moving forward required acknowledging past wrongs, not hiding from them, that true reconciliation meant changing systems, not just individual hearts, that the work of justice was never finished but required constant vigilance and courage. Isaiah spoke about the importance of education and economic opportunity in building a truly free society. He talked about the formerly enslaved people who were now landowners, business operators, educated professionals, contributing to their communities in ways that would have been impossible under slavery. He said that their success was the best argument against the lies that had been used to justify their bondage. The visit was brief, and they never returned to live in the South. Their lives were in Philadelphia, where they had built a community, raised children who grew up free and educated, and continued their work for justice. But the visit brought a kind of closure, a completion of a circle that had begun in that small room lit by a single candle. Clara and Isaiah lived into old age, dying within months of each other in the year 1892. By then, they had witnessed the end of slavery, the brief promise and then crushing disappointment of Reconstruction, and the rise of new systems of oppression designed to maintain white supremacy through different means. They died knowing that the battle they had fought was not over, that each generation would have to take up the struggle anew. But they also died knowing that they had made a difference, that the families they had helped reach freedom had built lives and raised children who might never have existed otherwise, that the students Clara had taught had gone on to become teachers themselves, spreading knowledge and opportunity, that the essays Isaiah had written had changed minds and hearts, contributing to the moral movement that ended legalized slavery. Their children continued their work. Their eldest son became a lawyer, arguing cases that challenged discriminatory laws. Their daughter became a physician, serving communities that had been denied adequate medical care. Their youngest child became a writer, documenting the stories of those who had fought for freedom, ensuring that the history of resistance would not be forgotten. The story of Clara and Isaiah, the preacher's daughter and the enslaved man who dared to love each other and challenge an entire system, became part of the oral tradition of the African American community. Grandmothers told it to grandchildren as an example of courage. Teachers used it to illustrate the human cost of slavery and the power of resistance. Activists invoked it as proof that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things. In the early 1900s, one of the families that Clara and Isaiah had helped escape published a memoir that included their story. The book was titled The Candle in the Window, after the single flame that had lit their planning sessions, and it became an unexpected bestseller. Suddenly, Clara and Isaiah's names were known beyond abolitionist circles, becoming symbols of interracial love and resistance that resonated with new generations fighting their own battles against injustice. The small town where it all began never fully acknowledged its role in the story. There was no historical marker, no monument, no official recognition of what had happened. The church building still stood, though it had changed hands several times and was no longer associated with any particular denomination. The Whitfield house was eventually torn down, replaced by a bank, then later by a parking lot. Physical evidence of their presence faded with time, but the story itself proved indestructible. It was passed down through families, white and black, who had been touched by Clara and Isaiah's courage. It was whispered in Sunday schools as an example of what real Christianity looked like. It was invoked during the civil rights movement of the 1960s, when another generation of young people risked everything to challenge systems of oppression. Scholars eventually pieced together the documentary evidence. Letters preserved by Margaret Whitfield and passed down through a distant cousin, financial records that showed the systematic diversion of church funds, testimony from descendants of those who had been part of the network. What emerged was a picture of a resistance movement that was far more organized and far-reaching than anyone had imagined, with Clara and Isaiah at its center, but supported by dozens of people who had each played a crucial role. The academic research revealed something else as well: the sophistication of their methods, the use of coded language, the manipulation of official systems, the creation of false documentation that was good enough to fool authorities. This was not a spontaneous or emotional rebellion, but a calculated strategic campaign that anticipated by decades the kind of organized civil disobedience that would characterize later civil rights movements. Modern historians studying the Underground Railroad came to recognize Clara and Isaiah's network as one of the most effective in the South during the 1850s. The success rate of families who used their system was extraordinarily high, a testament to careful planning and coordination. Conservative estimates suggest they helped between 40 and 60 people reach freedom, though the real number may have been higher. What made their network particularly effective was the way it utilized Clara's position of privilege. She had access to resources and authority that most Underground Railroad conductors lacked. She could move freely, correspond without suspicion, and manipulate official systems in ways that would have been impossible for someone without her social standing. Her willingness to use that privilege to dismantle the system that had granted it made her a unique figure in the history of resistance. Isaiah's contribution was equally crucial. His intelligence and his deep understanding of how slavery functioned allowed him to identify weaknesses in the system that others might have missed. He knew which overseers were lazy, which patrollers were susceptible to bribes, which routes were least monitored. He understood the psychology of those who enforced slavery and used that understanding to outmaneuver them. Together, they embodied a principle that would become central to future justice movements. That effective resistance requires both insider knowledge and the willingness to act on it. That privilege only becomes meaningful when it is leveraged to challenge the systems that create it. Their love story, which had seemed at the time like a personal tragedy destined to end in death or permanent separation, became instead a narrative of hope. Not naive hope that ignores reality, but hard-won hope that emerges from struggle. They proved that love could exist across lines designed to be uncrossable, that humanity could transcend categories imposed by law and custom, that two people committed to each other and to justice could change the world in measurable ways. The candle they had lit in that small room became a metaphor that resonated across generations. During World War II, resistance fighters in Europe used the phrase "light a candle" to refer to acts of defiance against Nazi occupation. During the Civil Rights era, freedom songs made reference to lights that could not be extinguished. During the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa, activists spoke of keeping flames alive through dark times. In each case, the metaphor carried the same meaning, that even in the darkest moments, even when systems of oppression seem overwhelming and permanent, a single light of resistance can illuminate the path forward, that small acts of courage accumulate into movements, that what begins with two people in a hidden room can eventually transform entire societies. The physical candle that Clara and Isaiah used was never preserved. It burned down to nothing on one of those planning nights, replaced by another and then another. But in a museum in Philadelphia, in a collection of artifacts from the abolitionist movement, there sits a simple brass candlestick with a small plaque that reads, "Believed to have belonged to Clara Whitfield and Isaiah, conductors on the Underground Railroad." Whether it is actually theirs is impossible to verify, but it serves as a tangible connection to their story, a reminder that history is made by real people making real choices. Visitors to that museum often stop at that candlestick for a long time. Some see in it a reminder of how much has changed since the 1850s. Others see how much has remained the same, how systems of oppression evolve but persist, how each generation must fight battles their ancestors thought they had won. Both perspectives are valid. Both are necessary. The truth is that Clara and Isaiah's story is both historical and contemporary. Historical in that it happened in a specific time and place, under a specific system of oppression that no longer exists in its original form. contemporary in that the themes it embodies, the courage, the resistance, the refusal to accept injustice as inevitable, remain urgent and relevant. Their story asks questions that every generation must answer for itself. What are you willing to risk for love, for justice, for the freedom of others? When faced with a choice between comfortable complicity and dangerous resistance, what will you choose? When systems demand your obedience, will you have the courage to question whether that obedience is justified? These are not abstract questions. They are as practical and immediate as they were in 1856. Every society has its systems of oppression, its hierarchies that benefit some at the expense of others, its unspoken rules that maintain injustice through social pressure and normalized cruelty. And every society has people like Clara and Isaiah, ordinary individuals who decide that they cannot remain silent, cannot remain complicit, cannot accept what they have been told is inevitable. The power of their story lies not in its uniqueness, but in its replicability. Clara was not born a hero. She was raised to be complicit, educated to accept and support the system that oppressed others for her benefit. Isaiah was not granted any special gifts beyond his humanity. He was denied education, denied autonomy, denied every advantage except his own determination and intelligence. What transformed them was not some extraordinary quality they possessed from birth, but a choice they made, a choice to see each other's full humanity, to question what they had been taught, to act on their convictions even when the cost was high. That choice is available to anyone. That transformation is possible for everyone. This is why their story continues to be told, why it matters beyond its historical significance. It serves as proof that change is possible, that systems that seem permanent can be challenged, that love and courage and intelligence can prevail against overwhelming odds. Not always, not easily, but often enough to make the struggle worthwhile. The candle in the window, that small flame in the darkness, represents every act of resistance throughout history. The parent who teaches their child to read in defiance of unjust laws, the person who hides refugees from persecution, the individual who speaks truth to power, knowing they will be punished, the couple who loves across boundaries designed to separate them, the community that organizes for justice, despite violent opposition. Each of these acts is a candle lit against the darkness. Each is a declaration that oppression, no matter how powerful it seems, no matter how many institutions support it, no matter how many people accept it as natural, is not inevitable. That another world is possible. That the arc of history, as long and twisted as it may be, can bend toward justice when people commit themselves to bending it. Clara and Isaiah's legacy is not just the lives they saved, or the children they raised, or the institutions they built. Their legacy is the example they set, the template they created for how ordinary people can challenge extraordinary injustice. They showed that you do not need to be powerful to be effective, that you do not need to be fearless to be courageous, that you do not need to win every battle to change the course of history. They also showed something that is easy to forget in the face of suffering and injustice, that resistance can be an act of love, not just love for those you are trying to save, though that is crucial, but love for the vision of what the world could be, love for human potential and dignity, love for the principle that every person deserves freedom and respect, and the opportunity to build a life of their own choosing. This kind of love is not soft or sentimental. It is fierce and demanding. It requires sacrifice and risk. It asks you to give up comfort and safety and privilege, but it also offers something profound in return. The knowledge that you lived according to your deepest values, that you did not turn away from injustice when you could have acted against it, that your life mattered in ways that extend far beyond your own immediate gratification. As we reflect on their story from the vantage point of the 21st century, we face our own systems of oppression, our own injustices that have been normalized and defended, our own opportunities to light candles in the darkness. The specifics differ, the mechanisms change, but the fundamental choice remains the same. Will we be complicit or will we resist? Will we accept what we are told is inevitable, or will we work to create something better? Clara and Isaiah would tell us, if they could, that the choice is difficult but not complicated, that you do not need to change the entire world alone, that every small act of resistance matters, that love and courage and intelligence, combined with strategic thinking and collective action, can accomplish what seems impossible. They would tell us that fear is natural and courage is not its absence, but the decision to act despite it. That you will make mistakes and face setbacks and doubt yourself. That the path of resistance is harder than the path of compliance. But that at the end of your life, you will be able to look back and know that you tried, that you stood for something, that you added your light, however small, to the accumulated brightness of all those throughout history who refused to accept injustice. The candle still burns, in museum displays and in metaphors, in stories told and retold across generations, in the ongoing work of justice that each generation must take up anew. It burns in the actions of everyone who chooses resistance over complicity, courage over comfort, love over hate. And perhaps most importantly, it burns in the simple recognition that systems of oppression are created and maintained by human choices, which means they can be dismantled by human choices, that what has been built can be rebuilt, that what has been accepted can be rejected, that the future is not predetermined but is being created right now, in this moment, by the choices we make and the actions we take. Clara Whitfield and Isaiah did not end slavery alone. They saved dozens of people, not thousands. Their resistance was local, not national. They were two individuals, not an army. But they added their light to the accumulated light of countless others who made similar choices, and together, those lights became bright enough to illuminate the path toward freedom. This is the enduring lesson of their story, not that heroes will save us, but that ordinary people, through courage and love and strategic action, can change the world. Not that change is easy or inevitable, but that it is possible and worth fighting for. Not that the battle against injustice is ever truly won, but that every victory, however small, matters profoundly. The candle in the window still beckons to us across the centuries. It asks us to look at our own world with clear eyes, to identify our own systems of oppression, to find our own courage. It reminds us that we are not alone, that we stand in a long tradition of resistance, that others have faced darkness as deep as ours and chose to light candles anyway. And it promises us that if we make that choice, if we commit ourselves to justice and love and resistance against cruelty, our lives will have meaning beyond our individual existence, that we will become part of something larger than ourselves, that we will add our chapter to the ongoing story of humanity's struggle toward freedom and dignity for all. The preacher's daughter and the enslaved man fell in love in a world that declared their love impossible and criminal. What the town did to them was indeed unspeakable in its cruelty, but what they did in response, the quiet revolution they started, the lives they saved, the example they set, speaks louder than all the hatred and violence arrayed against them. Their candle still burns, waiting for each of us to carry it forward, to add our light to theirs, to continue the work they began. The question is not whether we face injustice in our own time. We do. The question is whether we will have the courage to light our own candles, to take our own risks, to add our own chapters to the never-ending story of resistance against oppression and the eternal hope for a more just and loving world. This is their legacy, This is their gift to us. A candle in the window, burning still, illuminating the path they walked and inviting us to walk it too. Not because it is easy, but because it is necessary. Not because success is guaranteed, but because the attempt itself is what makes us fully human. Not because we will finish the work, but because we are called to take up our part of it, just as they took up theirs, with courage and love and the quiet determination that transforms the world, one act of resistance at a time.